Hundreds of thousands of rail passengers face travel chaos as train drivers at Southern Railway go on strike again.
It's going to be an utter nightmare.
Where do you have to get to?
I have to get to Durrington, so I'm going to have to walk 20 minutes to go and catch a bus. That'll take me an hour and then another 20-minute walk.
I'm absolutely really fed up with it. Most of the commuters are now. We're really, really fed up. And it needs to be solved. It really does.
Passengers at airports across the UK will face 2 days of disruption just before Christmas as some check-in staff and baggage handlers walk out.
Unless we fight now, the future of the whole of the post office network, high street post offices in particular, will no longer exist.
The strike will not impact Christmas deliveries, will not impact Christmas post. It's highly regrettable that the union is making these steps, but we will get on and ensure that customer disruption is absolutely minimised.
The great newspaper, The Times, they did a spread the other week where they were talking about the left trying to bring the government down. And it had the National Shop Stewards Network, the RMT, other left-wing organisations are coordinating to bring the government down. Shock horror. Guess what? We bloody are.
The last voice you heard there was that of Sean Hoyle, president of the RMT Rail Union. His words have reinforced the view of some that these strikes are above all political and that the law should be changed to protect the public. Amongst them, the MP for Croydon South, Conservative MP Chris Philp. Joining us also, Francis O'Grady, General Secretary of the TUC, who begs to differ. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Francis O'Grady, if we could begin with you, is there in your mind a link between these disputes? And doesn't that clip suggest that the link might well be politics?
These disputes are all different, but we are working in a background where workers are still £20 a week worse off on average than before the financial crash, where we're seeing inflation rise and real pay cuts coming. We've had the rise of 0 hours and sham self-employment. Now, unions are membership organisations of ordinary working people, and striking is always a last resort. We negotiate and settle thousands of deals. I think perhaps you should be focusing on what's wrong with these companies that we're ending up in a situation of a dispute. And by the way,
you say this, but surely train drivers, pilots, post office workers, these are not people affected by new working conditions, and frankly not amongst the ranks of the low paid either.
Well, the pilots you refer to aren't in fact a TUC affiliate. The pilots union that is a TUC affiliate, Belper, is working normally this Christmas, and that's where I worry that some people are trying to tell a story instead of dealing with the root causes of problems.
Well, let's bring Chris Philp in to react to that. We'll come back to you. She has a point, doesn't she? These are very separate disputes, and one clip of one union official, who's not even the General Secretary, doesn't prove a great deal.
Well, Sean Hoyle, who we heard speaking, is the president of the RMT, and he's part of an organisation called the National Shop Stewards Network, which he referred to, which is a group of senior trade union officials going across the union movement. And he was talking, as we heard, about bringing down the government. He also talked later in the clip, which we didn't hear, about replacing capitalism with socialism. And he also said if we all spit together, the we referring to the unions, we can drown the bastards. And that was referring to the democratically elected government of the UK. So I think
he was condemned yesterday, wasn't he, by the General Secretary of the RMT?
Well, the
man who actually runs negotiations said he didn't agree with them.
Well, look, let's look at their actions rather than what the General Secretary says. And the fact is they're preventing 300,000 people from getting to work over an extended period of time over who presses the button to open and close the doors on the train. But just on Francis's point,
I'm sorry, that is absolutely wrong and ridiculous. I think Chris yourself said earlier this year that Southern's performance was abysmal as a company and they should be stripped of their franchise. Now, if you recognise that their performance is so poor, they've spent weeks preparing court cases against the union instead of sitting around the table and trying to negotiate a fair settlement. Many people worry that there's another agenda here. I have enormous sympathy with passengers and staff on
the other
Southern.
Agenda being?
Well, some MPs seem to be calling for even more draconian laws against trade unions when we've just had the Trade Union Act. Now, I think most people agree striking is a last resort. We don't want to do that. We want a fair agreement.
Well, let's just hear what those changes to the law could be.
Is a fundamental British liberty that the vast majority of the public support, including voters across all parties.
Chris Philp, what are you suggesting in terms of legal changes? As the General Secretary of the TUC says, very soon after another set of legal changes were passed by Parliament.
Well, sadly, those aren't helping people using Southern Railway who are unable to get to work for a period of weeks or months because
they were
the conductors.
Unable to get to work
Francis, let me finish the point.
The whole year because of Southern's performance, as you admitted.
Francis, absolutely. I think Southern should lose the franchise, or GTR. But what's happened in the last few weeks? Just let me finish. What's happened in the last few weeks and months has taken it to a whole new level. For most of December and January, people are not going to be able to get to work. 300,000 people.
Well, they couldn't get to work before because Southern's performance is so poor.
Nothing like as bad as what's happening now. Look, I agree with
Francis O'Grady. I just want to get him to spell out the change of the law he wants, and then I'll get you to respond.
I agree with Meg Hillier, the Labour MP, who thinks that the unions have pushed this too far. I think we do need fresh legislation to do two things. Firstly, to say that on critical public infrastructure, which includes railways, to be lawful, strikes have to be reasonable and proportionate, and you would get a High Court judge, not politicians, to adjudicate what was proportionate and reasonable, because what we're seeing on Southern, where 300,000 people can't get to work over who presses a button, it's not proportionate and not reasonable. Secondly, they have laws in Spain and Italy and in Canada that say where there is a strike, it has to be such that you can still run about a 50% service. Okay. Look, I completely accept the right of people to strike, but it has to be reasonable and proportionate, and it can't inflict pain on the public that goes beyond the complaint.
Francis O'Grady, if they do it in Spain and Italy and Canada, why should you object?
We already have one of the toughest frameworks of law, and if we didn't have that free right to strike, then all the power would be in the hands of a bad employer. Let's remember.
But just deal, if you would, if you would, with the detail of the proposal. The suggestion is being made that people who are passengers in particular on a rail line are powerless, really, and that in Spain and Italy and Canada they get some protection. Why shouldn't they have that here?
I think in other countries you'll find that companies are required and there is a proper framework for real collective bargaining. But let's just remember that this dispute is about safety. On a 12-car train carrying over 1,000 passengers in the rush hour, the driver gets just 2 seconds to check 24 sets of doors. Now, we know that passengers, like staff, want guards on trains and they want them to have that safety critical role.
Let me just put it to Chris Philp.
I'm afraid that the ministers and the MPs on this are sometimes just out of touch with overcrowded, overpriced trains, companies getting huge public subsidies. Perhaps, like the Prime Minister, you should consider being on the side of working people for a change.
Chris Philp, let me put it to you that the agenda that Francis O'Grady talks about was given away in your own area of Croydon in South London when a senior civil servant in charge of the railways, a man called Peter Wilkinson, said, "We have," quotes, "got to break them." He was referring to the unions. There is an attempt to smash the RMT, isn't there? And not terribly surprisingly, they're fighting back.
Well, that's not an attempt I subscribe to, because I recognise the right of trade unions to exist and to hold reasonable and proportionate strikes. I'm on the side of residents in Croydon and up and down the Brighton Main Line who can't get to work and can't see their families. And on the safety point that Francis O'Grady mentioned, the Rail Safety Standards Board have said that driver-operated doors are safe. 1.5 million trains in the last 5 years have gone with driver-operated doors without a single fatality. And every single train that currently has 2 staff, driver and conductor, will be scheduled to continue to have 2 staff. No job losses, no pay cuts. This strike is needless, and RMT and ASDEF should call it off.
I think you should listen to your own constituents who have huge sympathy with the staff. Nobody wants a strike, but we need a fair settlement, and perhaps you should put pressure on the company to get back to the table and do just that.
Francis O'Grady, Chris Philp, thank you very much indeed.
It's